So this video is looking at what is cancel culture and can you ever really silence an author like J.K. Rowling, who has 14.2 million Twitter followers? The short answer is yes, you can, by looking at someone like Donald Trump, who was emphatically cancelled by Twitter itself just prior to the elections. However, as will become apparent over the course of this video, it's a lot more complicated. And the long answer is that this comes down to the society and the culture we live in. I'm going to look at covering three main points over the course of this video, namely, what is cancel culture? Why does it matter? And what impact does it have? Along the way, I'm going to look at historic literary references, also looking at the impact of censorship and whether or not cancel culture is actually censorship. And then at the end, making an assessment on that question about J.K. Rowling. So the primary question is going to be, can you ever really silence an author? And hopefully that will come clear across this video. If you look back to the popular press of the late 19th century, you had cases like Oscar Wilde, whose fall from grace was caused by his court case. And it set off a huge series of legislations and cultural spasms that caused nearly 100 years of societal discussions about LGBTQ issues. And it was only after the repeal of Section 28 in the late 90s that this conversation came back around. And then you had T.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was really the watershed moment within British literary culture, talking about censorship and whether or not the government had a place within society to censor free speech and literature. More pertinently, during the 1980s, you then had Salman Rushdie, who, through the fatwa that was issued with him by the Iranians, that you ended up with him essentially becoming cancelled by his own self, and he had to go into hiding. So his voice was diminished, and essentially you had a state actor counselling him for a book he had written. In relation to what happened to Oscar Wilde, you then saw many LGBTQ authors across history, going all the way back to Sappho during the Greek period, who potentially have been cancelled. And the state has actively censored minority voices of whatever hue. It's repressed them in ways ranging from full-blown censorship to cultural censorship. There's been lots of religious censorship that has generally quelled minority voices. And so you can see a clear deplatforming of those minority voices throughout history. Indeed, many feminists have been cancelled. And since the 1970s, there's been a low-lying cancelling of feminist voices who've sought to challenge the patriarchal axes of power. And those systems of power have generally tried to cancel those women, which ties in with this conversation about J.K. Rowling. And so what you are seeing pre the internet is that the mainstream media, such as the BBC, the press barons, the publishing houses, had real power to both elevate and dethrone voices, and that when those voices were deplatformed across the mainstream media, they lost the power that they had. Now, obviously, J.K. Rowling flows from that pre-internet age. I mean, she started writing just as the internet was gaining traction, and so it's interesting to see how much the internet has actually changed who gets cancelled and who gets platformed. And then alongside that, you also get the situation that you get brigading, where people who don't necessarily agree with an author's position have now got an opportunity, even if the platform is successful and as large as J.K. Rowling, smaller minority groups and smaller voices can brigade together to challenge those people who are at the center of power. And so you then see counselling as a form of potential censorship, and also as a form of potential trolling as well, because even within minority groups, you still see members of those groups being targeted for cancellation if they don't abide by what potentially is seen as the party line. And so where does this all lead for J.K. Rowling? And the issue of J.K. Rowling is that not just what she has said, it's not just one thing. She's used her platform to amplify other people's voices. And while she herself has been very careful not to be overtly derogatory, there's a lot of potential dog whistles that she has used that have been clear-cut examples of other people saying things, and she's platformed other people's opinions. She's platformed what are called trans exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs, at the expense of not really looking at the nuance of the situation. She's taken a very strident platform, and in the articles that she's written, she's been very clear that she feels attacked because she's taking this particular platform. So she is using her power dynamics to amplify other people's voices. And this is why she was originally targeted for cancelling and potentially deplatforming. And it's also why it caused a lot of outrage amongst these groups, because she has such a strong following that when she gives other people a voice through that platform, it can have a significant impact, and it can also have an impact on how her audience views those people who she's choosing to platform. So why does this matter? Cancelling impacts the perception of whoever is being the target for cancellation. It can potentially impact their income. It can impact their access to platforms, as the original situation with Donald Trump clearly shows. And it has an impact on people's personal lives and willingness to get further involved in situations. And this is one of the double-edged swords of what is being perceived as cancel culture, is that while it can have impact, so for instance through the Me Too movement, where people in authority and people in power are being challenged, and then when their ill behavior is being shown, that is then being cancelled because society deems that their ill behavior is beyond the pale. Those members of minority groups who get targeted by cancel culture within those communities can be significantly impacted by those involved. ContraPoints raised a very interesting video about this, and she explained that it wasn't just her who was being targeted, it was anybody who was supporting her, it was anybody who was providing financial support for her. She lost subscribers through her Patreon. And so there's a whole range of issues, not least is the mental health of the person involved. And J.K. Rowling raised this when she talked in her article about the impact it's had on herself, is that she was saying that her mental health is being affected by this. So it's not as simple as saying, we'll cancel this person, we'll deplatform, they're no longer going to have to speak for us. And Me Too in particular, the Me Too movement has used cancel culture as a weapon of choice, because often the people they're targeting, especially the people in authority, have not been dealt with by the law or by wider society. So by essentially counselling them, it is the first recourse for victims and for those who are outside the primary centres of power to reclaim some of that power. R. Kelly has been a classic example of this. Before he was arrested, there was a long campaign over the last 15-20 years to expose his ill behaviour. And while he wasn't prosecuted, or while he was outside the lengths of the law, a lot of people refusing to listen to his music. And it was a personal choice that those people chose to take. And since Michael Jackson was prosecuted, a lot of people have felt the same about Michael Jackson. When it comes to women and feminist voices, you've got all that feminist history of female voices being cancelled by the mainstream because what they are saying don't match up with what society wants them to say. Julie Bindel is a classic example of this. Is prior to her issues again with TERF voices, a lot of what had upset the mainstream society was the fact that she was a very strident feminist, and a lot of her conversations were centered around feminism and what could be done about it. And then there has to be this great reassessment of a person's creative output, especially when that person is cancelled. How do you view the content they've created? J.K. Rowling, this whole conversation over the last 2 years, has prompted many trans fans of her work to question their very engagement with her work and whether or not the wider society still accepts it. And clearly there is a conversation to be had around that. Those fans have had to clearly engage with their own fandom and ask themselves, is the literature and the work she's putting out there worth their emotional labor to engage with all the other things that have been said about her? And then this whole mechanism of counselling, it can provide a catharsis for those minority voices and say, well, actually, this is who we are. We're challenging you because of what you've said. And by counselling you, we're going to gain that cathartic moment. However, if the wider society doesn't engage with that, that catharsis can only be temporary. That then leads on to a wider issue that counselling and brigading can merge, and often do merge together. That for counselling, for online counselling in particular to happen, it requires lots and lots and lots of small voices talking up and working together. And traditionally on the internet, that's often been used for trolling, that's been used to actually outright attack people. And what cancel culture has done is co-opt that dark internet culture and try to use it as a force for justice. However, because the internet is not a court of law, the burden of proof is often a lot less, and also the situation online is a lot more fluid and a lot more nuanced than it would be in trying to prove someone guilty or not guilty in a court of law. It can take a single moment. Someone can say the wrong thing, or in an off-the-cuff moment, do the wrong thing, and that can lead to them being cancelled. Now, often the consequences of that, as I've said before, can have a really big impact on people's lives, and no one is holding those who seek to cancel account for their actions, primarily because usually it's coming from a place of justice. But what sort of justice that is complicated. It's also true that counselling actually never really silences people, partly because counselling comes from, especially if it's minority people trying to counsel someone from a centre of power, unless that person who they're trying to counsel is prosecuted and wider society rejects that person, it can be very difficult for the counselling to gain traction, which in turn leads to wider issues. Like, is the counselling actually there to shift the conversation? Is the counselling there to bring attention to ill behaviour, or is the counselling being done because of a specific moment in time? And this then leads into a wider issue: is counselling censorship? Is it something that we as a society, without censorship legislation, should condone? And therefore, is it wrong? And this then boils down to a question of freedom of speech, because freedom of speech is such an ingrained factor into British society and in American society as well. It also comes down to who actually polices that freedom of speech, because it comes with significant caveats, especially on social media, where no platform actually has absolute freedom of speech. Anyone who posts on social media has to abide by terms and conditions. They have to abide by the spirit of the communities that they're engaging with. And often free speech is ill-defined on those platforms because those terms and conditions and community rules are not very clear, which then make it reliant on the platforms themselves to police ill behavior. And it can often result in suppression of speech for minority groups themselves, because they're trying to tackle certain issues. There have been plenty of cases where people have been banned for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, or just entirely banned from platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, for trying to point these issues out. And people with high profiles like J.K. Rowling or Donald Trump will only ever get censured or banned from those platforms if they go beyond the pale, which clearly Donald Trump did. However, with J.K. Rowling, she hasn't been banned from the platforms, and especially Twitter still gives her a platform to talk about the issues. So in terms of censorship, we as a society are reliant on these platforms to judge what is acceptable and what isn't. And often that can then boil down to what is acceptable for the corporation and what looks good for the corporation. And then it also comes down to what makes for good conversation, what makes for good clicks, what is going to make you stay on the site. And an argument is better than a one-liner that we can all agree with. So this confrontation, there is a commercial imperative there as well, that cancel culture online, who does it benefit ultimately? And that then leads into the wider question of impact, and who does it impact? Who does cancel culture benefit? You have Julie Burchill, was a long-time writer for The Guardian, and she put forward some very complex feminist arguments, and she also potentially platformed a lot of trans-exclusionary radical feminist ideology through her articles. And you also had Nick Griffin back in the late 90s and early noughties, who platformed the BNP, and he was their spokesperson. He was put all across the media, and then he was eventually cut out completely. He was cancelled by most of the mainstream media because of his views. And so those two combined are a very interesting example of how deplatforming can work in the internet age. It's not that their voices are not there, they're still in the background, but because the platforms that they exist on are smaller and they don't actually have a mainstream voice, it makes their views harder to get attention. And this is where J.K. Rowling's platforming of certain voices comes in. It's like she is platforming these minority voices and amplifying what they are saying. So the impact of her using those platforms, the impact of her using her freedom of speech, isn't a danger to her personally, but she doesn't understand the full complexities of what she is talking about. She conflates a lot of her personal experiences with trans experiences. And so while she has every right to say what she's saying, because of the power of her voice, because of the amount of money she's earned, because of the amount of Twitter followers she's had, she has been able to build a platform for herself that cuts through the noise that other people who are saying similar things or more extreme things wouldn't necessarily have. And because she then shares their content, she has a significant impact, especially on the British conversation around trans identities. She is having an impact on that conversation purely because of the celebrity and the money that she's been able to build through her writing and her creative output. So when it comes to cancelling J.K. Rowling, you're not just cancelling her voice, you're cancelling all the momentum that has been built up around her. And so if you were ever to try to silence her, unless there is some significant scandal where she has done something that breaks the law, it's going to be virtually impossible to fully silence her voice. Whether or not you'd want to silence her voice is another matter entirely. And so it comes back to power. Where is the power in this conversation? 20 years ago, J.K. Rowling had no intrinsic power. She was an inspiring author. She published Harry Potter, and she was building a fandom for the Harry Potter franchise. And through the success of her books, she's been able to build this platform, which she's then leveraged into whichever cause she wants to do. And by jumping on the bandwagon of affecting trans rights, she is using that platform in a way that potentially causes intrinsic harm to a lot of very vulnerable and very uncertain individuals. Like the state, Britain has some very affirmative trans legislation. It's illegal to discriminate against trans people within the UK. However, the wider conversation about access to bathrooms, about the changes to the Gender Recognition Act, it comes back to this notion of womanhood. It comes back to this notion of access to services, and there's a whole conflation of this. So she started out as an author writing books that hit the zeitgeist and hit a specific moment in time, which she's then used to discuss women's issues, which she's clearly very passionate about. Counselling is all about privilege, and it's looking at how privilege, the dynamics of privilege, are utilized and leveraged by those who have privilege. And if that privilege is being leveraged against minority people, it becomes a significant problem. And so when minorities fight back against that privilege, it then kicks off this whole debate about platforms like Twitter. It says, what is Twitter for? Is it a platform for freedom of speech? Is it a platform to put one's views out there? Is it a platform to market oneself? Is it a platform through which you build and grow your own development? Now, that's a matter for another day. But in terms of being able to fight back against perceived ill behavior, like the trans community did against J.K. Rowling, that you end up almost with David against Goliath, except you've got 1,000 Davids and one Goliath. But even then, the Goliath will still come out on top if society doesn't necessarily want doesn't want the Goliath to be cancelled, especially in the mainstream media. I would argue that cancelling isn't censorship, but it is still an arbitrary and reactive process that can often be scattergun. It almost invokes a Streisand effect, potentially drawing attention to an issue that was very much below the radar, but then suddenly through the attempt to cancel, you end up amplifying those issues beyond what they would otherwise have. And again, this is a point that ContraPoints raised. It doesn't just impact the person being cancelled, it can impact their supporters, it can impact a whole swathe of people around them, and also might conflate the issue that the councillors are looking to cancel with a whole range of other issues. And so there is this danger that while there can be positives from counselling, especially with the Me Too movement having counselled men who clearly have had significant ill behaviour, when it comes to other minority voices, there has to be a real care and attention made to what exactly the person has said, what exactly they're looking to counsel the person for, but also what is the collateral impact of that potential counselling. I would argue that the counselling attempt of J.K. Rowling was not censorship. It was those minority voices attempting to leverage a bit of power for themselves and leverage ultimately what they could from the situation they were in. They're having to fight an uphill battle, especially minority trans voices are having to fight an uphill battle against what the mainstream media are putting out anyway. So because J.K. Rowling's voice has so much leverage and so much weight behind it, and because it has she's viewed with a significant degree of credibility, I don't think you could ever truly cancel her. And I don't think it would be wise or pragmatic to do that. However, by attempting to cancel her, there's been a shift in the conversation. And the shift is clearly there to aid trans voices, aid minority voices who've been impacted by her. And from a literary perspective, it's raised a whole raft of questions about her work. So ultimately, I don't think cancel culture will ever really silence people. She's still, J.K. Rowling's still in print, and many of the people who've been impacted by cancel culture previously are in print. Lady Chatterley's Lover proved the point that you can never really cancel an idea, never really cancel a book. Same with Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde has been rehabilitated, and he is a cultural totem. So cancel culture is very much in the moment. And when we reflect on J.K. Rowling's work in 30, 40, 50 years' time, 100 years' time, where will she sit within the canon? Where will she sit within the literary establishment? And that is a wider question that I think is being sparked by this attempt to cancel her. And that process is only just beginning. So yeah, thank you for listening and thank you for watching, and I hope you found this interesting.